the ASEG acknowledges the traditional owners of the land on which we get together today and many lands on which we undertake our work. We recognize their continuing connection to these lands, waters, culture, and pay our respects to their elders, past and present. We would like to thank our corporate members and our branch sponsors. And today, the online delivery will be using Teams. And you could put your questions in the chat box. And the QA session will be at the end of the talk. And you could also unmute your micro, then we have some discussions later on. And I'm not going to read this again for the member benefits. You could find out on our website. So today we will have Jared and Karl from the USGS and the AEST to give us a talk titled An Interactive Workflow for MT Data, Magnetotelluric Data, using open source packages and HPC, high performance computer. Then Jared. Jared is a research geophysicist at the Geology, Minerals, Energy, and Geophysics Science Center in Menlo Park, California. He received his Ph.D. from the University of Adelaide, here in Australia, and bachelor's and master's degree from the Colorado School of Mines, all in geophysics. He joined the USGS in 2013. His expertise is in magnetotellurics, focusing on characterizing volcanics, geothermal, and mineral systems in 3D. Karl has held roles in the development of remote sensing and digital data processing techniques, mostly in electromagnetics and acoustics, with applications ranging from unexploded ordnance, resource exploration, and borehole investigations to measurements while drilling. Karl received master's and Ph.D. degrees in engineering geoscience from the University of California. After completing a bachelor's degree in mathematics and physics at the University of Victoria, Karl is an active contributor to MTH5, MT metadata, and the main developer of Aurora, hosted by UBS SIMPAC. Karl currently acts in the role of magnetotelluric specialist within DIAS Geophysical's R&D team in his native Canada, and it's also an affiliated research scientist at the Space Science Institute in the USA. Now I just get the slides out. Then I hand over to Karl and Jared. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks Wing-Ping, and thanks ASEG for inviting us to give a talk on what we've been working on the past couple of years, and that's an interactive workflow for MT using open source packages, and then using those on HPC to process and model data. I'm Jared. He's Karl.
Yes, it looks all right here, but show you the big screen. Outgoing, let's say quickly.
If anyone is dialed in, yeah, hopefully it comes as a full screen share to you. We see the PDF outline around it.
Not the end of the world, is
Yeah.
it, if we see that outline?
Yeah.
Share a full screen. Do that? Sure, why not? Yeah, we'll share the screen. Okay. Do. Full screen.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's why there's always two. Smart one. Okay, anyway. Yep, so thanks. Yep. MT workflow using open source packages. This might introduce MT again for those of you who may have heard it passing, but not quite sure what it is. So it's a natural geophysical measurement that measures the Earth's response to natural time-varying magnetic fields. And the physical property that we measure is electrical resistivity. Why is that important? Because electrical resistivity is sensitive to where fluids are or where they have been. And so you're good at identifying faults, looking at geothermal systems, mineral systems, volcanic hazards, looking for water. It's a quite versatile technique. It's also got a nice dynamic range, so you can measure down from a couple of meters down to hundreds of kilometers. You not only get depth information, but you get directional information as well. So this makes it conducive to 3D modeling. The motivation for this project was to allow non-specialists in MT to use MT data. One of the big drivers behind this was that in the US, the data repository called IRIS, the Integrated Research Institute of Seismologists, wanted to expand and they wanted to add MT to their instrument pool. And they came to the MT community and said, what's your data standard? How do people use this? Can we build tools so that it's easier for people to use? And the motivation was that when seismologists come and borrow their instruments, they would also take an MT instrument or a couple, and so they could do surveys next to each other. The other motivation is that in the past couple of years, it's been a big initiative by governments and academic agencies to make data fair, so that's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reproducible. So I work for the government, so that's a big push on our side. But we also wanted to develop a fully open source workflow so that using MT data isn't so cryptic for those who aren't specialists in it. And what that means is from collecting raw data to estimating transfer functions to building resistivity models. What we'll present today is a workflow that builds on two data types. Two main types of MT data are time series. This is what you collect in the field, often on the scale of gigabytes. These time series have become more important in recent, probably past 10 years or so, for groups that are looking at space weather, geomagnetically induced currents, lightning strikes, and even earthquakes. There's a broad range of geophysical branches of geophysics that are also interested in these time series, so it's important for us to make them available to them. The other data type is transfer functions, and these are the processed time series. This is a frequency dependent Earth response, and these are often on the order of kilobytes or megabytes, but this is the most common data type that people will use for MT. So these are useful for imaging subsurface and also estimating impacts to geomagnetic storms. We built a general workflow going from time series to transfer functions. There's a couple open source packages that are actively being developed. So one is MT metadata, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But what the importance of that package is that it validates your metadata for time series and transfer functions. The main data container here for time series, transfer functions, and even Fourier coefficients is what's called an MTH5. So we've built a wrapper package for that to be able to access and manipulate those data. That's your time series container that gets pushed into Aurora, which is a time series processing code. So that's where you're going to estimate your transfer functions. And once you get your transfer functions, you want to be able to visualize and analyze them. So there's active development on a package called MTPy. This would be MTPy version 2. And then if you want to model your data, there's an open source package called SimPeg, and this is developed by a group at University of British Columbia who've done a great job of incorporating modeling. So SimPeg not only models MT, but you can also do gravity, magnetics, joint inversions. So through this presentation, we'll be talking about each one of these packages briefly. For me, maybe. So MT metadata. So when IRIS started to build the data or the instrument repository, they set up a working group to build metadata standards for time series. And it was kind of like this cartoon here on the right, is that if you want to build metadata standards, you look at what's already available and then you build your own. So we did that over the course of 2 years. I was the unlucky/lucky person to lead that group and discuss vehemently about metadata keywords and standards. So that's been developed, it's published, and it will be the standard for MTH5. Transfer functions, there's metadata standards out there currently. So the classic one is EDI. This was developed in the 1980s. And so it's got some, I don't know, well, it's got some flaws with it, but that's okay. The newer version is EMTF XML, and this is more of a self-describing format for transfer functions. So we've set up the MT metadata to follow how you would collect data in the field. So it's got different levels of metadata. So at the top, we have an experiment. And below that, we have a survey. A survey contains a bunch of stations. A station contains a bunch of runs, and a run contains a bunch of channels. And at each step, there's certain metadata that goes along with it, so that each step is a self-describing step that can be used in the future. The way metadata works is that there's a standard file. So there's a JSON file that comes with the package that describes the metadata for the different components. That gets loaded in when you initiate the package, and that allows the validators to understand what metadata or what needs to be validated for that metadata attribute. So say you're looking at your station, you want to add, or you want to look at station for latitude here on the right. So when you pull it up, it gives you information about that latitude. And down at the bottom, we're doing some validation. So you want your latitude here, it wants to be a floating point number. But we input it as just hours, minutes, seconds. The validator knows that it wants to be a float, and it can convert that format into a float. So the importance of the metadata package is that validation of metadata. So MTH5. So MTH5 is a data format that we developed, and it follows the metadata and also how you would collect your data. So again, there's different levels, and I'll go through those in a second. But I'll just say that MTH5 is built on HDF5, which was developed as an archive format. It's quite popular. There's different software packages that can read HDF5. So if you use MATLAB or you use R or Go, even there's options to open HDF5s and read them in. We chose HDF5 because it's self-describing, so it holds data and metadata next to each other. Reads from memory, so it makes reading fast. So even if you have a 20 gigabyte file, once you open it, you immediately have access to the data. There's no time wasted on trying to open and read everything. You could, in theory, incorporate an entire survey or even an entire experiment in a single file. You probably only want to do that if you have an archive and you never want to move that file. HDF5 can be used for parallel computing. So say you want to use it on NCI, there's that option. And it's going to be the new, well, MTH5 is going to be the new archive time series for USGS, OSCOPE, and ERSCOPE. The way we built MTH5 is that it can hold not only time series, it can hold transfer functions, and it can also hold the intermediate, which is the Fourier coefficients. So you could have all your MT information in one file. So if someone was like, hey, what does that station look like? You could be, okay, here's time series, here's Fourier coefficients, and the transfer function. Do what you like, right? So the HDF5 file is set up so at the top level, there's an experiment. And under an experiment, you can have multiple surveys. Each survey will contain different stations. One important part here is that we added filters at the survey level. So these are the filters that will calibrate your data, your time series data, so that it'll be in physical units. We put it at the survey level because often the channels are repeated and we didn't want repeated filters all over the place. So you got your filters there. You got stations under the survey, then you have runs, and then underneath that you have channels. We set it up so that you could have electric channels, magnetic channels, and auxiliary channels. So say if you have temperature or you did a TEM loop there or something else, you could add that data in. Along with an MTH5 file comes the metadata standards that it used, which is important. So you don't have to go and look them up. You can just open the file and see that, okay, this was the keyword that was used. This is what it means. Theoretically, you could add in reports. I'm not sure how to do that yet, but supposedly you can. You could add reports, you could add pictures or what have you. So that's the data format. So you can do that yourself. If you want to use MATLAB or some other program, you can design the MTH5 under those standards. But we've built an open source Python package that wraps around the MTH5 file type. And the benefit of this is that we've added a lot of attributes and methods to make it easier to get into an MTH5 and access it, change stuff around, manipulate it, put it back in. The way we set it up is that when you pull data in, it comes in as an X-array. And what an X-array is Karl will talk about it a little bit more. But what an X-array is a fancy indexed array. So not only can you index it by time, but you can index it by coordinate as well. So it makes it easy to access. It comes with a lot of methods and attributes built by the X-array team, which is part of the PyData. So if you use Python, it's NumPy, SciPy, Pandas, X-array. They're all well contributed and well-maintained packages. So don't blame us for things that don't work. We also added some SciPy accessors to the objects. So when you pull it down as a time series, it comes in as a channel or a run. You can filter the data, you can interpolate, you can resample, what have you, straight from those as methods from that object. A couple things we added with MTH5 is a summary table of all the channels. So this is built once your file is either opened or closed. And it's a nice access table. So it'll come as a data frame, which tells you every channel that's in that MTH5. So if you're not sure, you can just open it up. You can query the data, pull just the data that you want, and close that file back up. There's also one for transfer function as well. And again, the metadata standards come with the MTH5. Now, Karl.
Okay, so we've had an introduction to MT metadata and to MTH5. And so in the ecosystem that is this full workflow from time series to eventually resistivity models, Aurora is basically it fills the role of transforming the MTH5 archive into the transfer function format. And there's sort of this encapsulation diagram here, which, so MT metadata fits the triangle, and MTH5 depends on MTH5, MTH5 depends on MT metadata. And in that same way, Aurora requires that the data coming at it be formatted in the MTH5. I thought to make it more general, but it was actually the pieces could be reused. But it's been really nice to work with the MTH5 file, and it's removed almost all of the work that you have to do with managing your metadata, because it's all available. And I'll go about that. So it is an emulation of EMTF, which is sort of a legacy Fortran code that Gary Egbert wrote and has been ported into MATLAB. But hasn't really been put on a GitHub repository or made easy to use by the community, easy to use for the community. So that's kind of how it, that was the baseline first implementation that was done about 3 years ago. It was just a translation of the code. And then from there, last year, we spent some time just building out workflows and examples. And then this year, we did some wide scale testing on the data at EarthScope. So, yeah, so this is kind of the summary of the flow and sort of the philosophy of the processing approach. So there's this notion of a transfer function kernel is what it's called inside of the software. It's a class, but it's essentially, the flow is to go from having your data and a recipe for processing that data. So specification of processing parameters. Those are really once those two things are defined, that's enough to define what the transfer function is going to be. And so the Aurora is really the box in the middle, the TF estimation. that's where the processing happens, which breaks into two distinct chunks. But those chunks basically look at the processing configuration for information about how to apply the transformations. And they get their data from this, what I call a kernel data set, which is just a class that references MTH5 data. And for what it's worth, I put in the background there which package things belong to. So you can see that the inputs in TF kernel are actually the processing config is actually an MT metadata object, which means it has a lot of nice properties that have been carefully built in MT metadata. So you can push it to a JSON file. You can there's been a lot of work in making it validatable and that the standards for it are recorded. So that's all there in the inputs, and it's there again in the outputs. So the transfer function object is an MT metadata object. This is, for what it's worth, the little matrix equation in the corner. That is the equation that we're solving. So if you're not very exposed to MT, it's the matrix in the middle that we're estimating. And I guess I just point out that the observations in the field are the electric fields here called EX and EY, and the magnetic fields HX, HY. For what it's worth, there's a nomenclature inside of the processing, but you can change that nomenclature if someone gives you data with different labeling, which happens a lot. Different people will share data in different formats. So that's, I think, what I wanted to say about that. I'm just going to go over this very briefly. There's actually two of these, and I'm just going to rush through them a little bit because the point of providing Aurora is that it's an example of a workflow that does all of this, that you don't really need to worry about these details. This is the description of what has been implemented. So remember, there was two stages inside of sort of the main processing. The first one was a transformation, and then the second one is essentially a regression. So the transformation starts with the MTH5 object on the left as sort of the input coming through the top, through this run time series object. And then on the left, the other input into the processing is this, I called it processing config.json. So it could be a JSON file. It's just, it's a processing object from MT metadata. The point is that we go through these steps: pre-whitening, ensembleizing, tapering, FFT, recoloring. Basically, we build spectrograms. And what's here is an example of how to do that. That's been benchmarked against synthetic data and a bunch of other data sets, and basically behaves reasonably well. So you don't need to write it again, and you don't really need to deal with the code inside of it, but it is open source. And if you wanted to deal with the code inside of it or suggest a better or faster way, please do. And there's a place, there's a repository where you're welcome to do that. Similarly, the second chunk of the processing, now we have these short time Fourier transform or spectrograms, and they go into another processing flow. And so once again, there's a JSON file that you can use. And you don't, so I'll just mention that these processing configurations, they don't tend to be changed very much. And the way the software is set up, there's been an effort made to generate you a default one based on the properties of your data. And so you don't really need to spend much time with it, but if you wanted to, it's there, and it's in a format that can be looked at easily. But at any rate, we basically work band by band. So it's an embarrassingly parallelizable problem. And we basically compute weights for the data. Right now it's using effective degrees of freedom. There are a couple other popular ways to compute weights. And there are other open source packages that have this available. And I'm just waiting for some bandwidth to merge those in or communicate with the people who are writing those and find out a way to best share the tools. But anyway, it's a regression problem, and what you get is a transfer function object. So that's the thing that we would do modeling with later. Very briefly, Jared mentioned the processing summary. So, or pardon me, the channel summary. So channel summary is essentially, you know, if you give me an MTH5, I can open it. I just can see this table, which shows me exactly what data is in it. I can compress that to another animal called a run summary, which is a little bit less dense. It's not one row per instrument that's laid out, but one row per data acquisition. And then from there, I can select what I want to process, and that's my kernel data set. So there's basically two kinds of structures that I think I mentioned before, but there's basically tabular structures, which is your data management. And then there's these dictionary-like structures, which are your metadata. And so there's a couple snippets of what the JSONs look like. And you can see, you can put them into places where you have the arrows that collapse them and open them up, let you change things. So you can change things programmatically, or you can change them by deleting a value in a file and writing in another value. The data, the software is benchmarked every time we push an update on GitHub. It's got pretty reasonable code coverage. I don't have a number for it, but it's over 50%. I think it's closer to 70. It's not terrible. But we also use some integrated tests. So there's some synthetic data, for example, for a 100 ohm half space. And every time the data are pushed, that data is reprocessed and validated that we get back some sanity check results. For what it's worth, we run this against some archive results from EMTF, which is kind of like the code that we modeled the regression after in any case. And we get basically similar RMS differences. So that's there, which is nice. This is an example of processing, and I think I think there might be one last slide for the Aurora, but then we'll talk about what you do with the transfer functions. But this is the code, and it's actually, this is, it's even less lines than this right now. But essentially, you import something that creates those processing config files. You import the processing command itself, a couple of things, but basically you point at your data file, which is the 8P, the MTH5 path. And then from there, you summarize what's in the file. You then ask for a kernel data set, and you tell it which station you want to process, and if you want a remote reference station in there. And that's pretty much what so now you've specified a data set, and then you create a processing configuration. You'll notice that the kernel data set is an argument to create the function. So it takes a look at the data set, tries to make some appropriate decisions, and gives you back a config. And then you call process MTH5. And that is, you can write that now out to an XML, EDI, or whatever you want, but you're back in that MT metadata object. So that's, and so here's just a benchmark example from some real field data. There's two different color schemes here. And I think the black circles and triangles are Aurora, and the blue and red are EMTF. But again, the point is that the first order, the results are really similar. For example, there's a frequency band where we have some noise, and both of the codes are imperfect there. That's just the way it is. Hopefully Aurora would be a place where people could contribute or suggest noise suppression algorithms, and we could test them against benchmark, or maybe we should co-develop a package similar. Where from there, I'm not sure. As far as the best way to add those new packages, that's a community discussion topic. But basically, I'll just mention that there's been some recent additions. We've robustified the processing configuration so that before it starts executing, it goes and takes a look at the data and makes sure that there aren't any parameters that'll lead to obvious failures. For example, if you're decimating your data smaller and smaller, that the data set won't get smaller than the window size. It won't even try to do that. It'll mark that as an invalid kind of branch of a graph, if you will. Storing the Fourier coefficient files, as Jared mentioned, and over the summer we tested more than 1,000 files at EarthScope, basically processed data to transfer functions, and wound up with basically good agreement with what was being archived. So we feel like it's reasonably well tested, at least on the EarthScope data sets. Starting to get into testing it on other data. And that's it. As far as the testing, it would be nice to start running on higher frequency data. And I am actually working on that currently. So I'm excited about that, and there will be more updates. Aurora only uses one remote reference station. So there are some really cool processing schemes that take advantage of sort of the massively multi-channel nature that surveys can have. And that's not there yet. Certainly would be nice to build that, and would like to talk to people who are interested in collaborating on that. There's also cool things you can do, maybe mixing in with more channels, but right now it assumes classic MT, which means you're either doing a tipper or geomagnetic depth sounding 3 channels, or you're doing 4 or 5 channels. That's how it's set up. Data cleaning, I mentioned, I'd like to get more weighting of bad data automated, and there are some interesting options for that I'm reading into, and you're welcome to talk to me about them or offer to contribute on them. Yeah, so future work, I think I mentioned the plugins. Yeah, I think I already mentioned that. So I think that's it. So we can build transfer functions. They're reasonably robust. It's not perfect, but it's there, and you can use it. So
I guess I'll mention 2 things. So one for MTH5 is that we built readers for the various data loggers. So there's one in there for Zong data readers, Phoenix instruments, Lemmy instruments, the Earth data loggers, and we're hoping to get Metronics and a couple others in there as well. And the other thing I'll mention with Aurora is that the reason we're here in Australia is because we helped out with a conference or a workshop on using MT data on HPC, and Karl was able to use Aurora and process 90 stations in about a minute. So things are working, things are up and running. That's so once you get your transfer functions, you need a tool to look at your data or look at the transfer functions, analyze them, build input files to different modeling schemes. And so we've developed this package called MTPy, and you may have used MTPy in the past, and it's been had a rough history. For whatever reason, it's slowly been not supported anymore. So I sort of took it over again, and it's now sitting under MTPy-V2 for administrative reasons. So feel free to install them. There's been a lot of updates underneath the hood. So if you've used MTPy before, MTPy version 2 might be a little different. So just heads up. There is better documentation, and there's some good example notebooks in there for you to peruse. So there's plotting schemes, analyzing schemes, be able to input files or build input files to popular modeling programs like ModEM, SimPeg, what have you. And then there's tools to analyze the outputs of those models. There's a couple things to do. The future, hopefully, is that MTPy will be kind of the controller so that you don't have to install all these different packages. You can just install MTPy, and you'll have control of Aurora. You'll have control of MTH5. Main change for MTPy is that we centralized a lot of the methods and the objects. The main object is an MT object. This was also in the original version. And what this MT object is it's a single station transfer function. It's got a lot of methods with it, like rotation, remove static shift, remove distortion, estimate distortion, what have you. But the main change with MTPy version 2 is that we now have this thing called an MT container. And what that is under the hood is it's an MTH5 that holds the transfer functions. The benefit of this is that once you build your MT container, you have all your transfer functions in a single file. So you don't have to go back and load all those files in again. You just have it all in one file. You send that file to somebody else, they can open it, and boom, they have all access to your transfer functions. So that's now the central object, and from that central object, you can do all sorts of plotting methods. You can write different data files for modeling programs. You can, build different maps, tools, and it just makes it easier. It's more like a data frame or data center for all your data. So you no longer have to load in all your EDI files for each thing you want to do. It's all centralized into this main container. The other couple changes is that we've added SymPeg into MTPy. So now once you say your MT object, you can say to SymPeg 1D and it'll run as 1D inversion of your data. We're adding 2D and 3D to those as well. We removed, if you dealt with the original version, there was this painful thing called GDAL. I had some installation issues, so we removed dependence on GDAL and we use PyProject for everything. The documentation's been updated, so feel free to have a look at that. So SymPeg is kind of the new addition to MTPy into the workflow. This is a open source Python package developed by the University of British Columbia, and they mainly developed this as an educational tool, but over the past couple of years, they've really built it up to be high performance and work on an HPC. So it's not only for MT, it also includes gravity, magnetics, some DC, different EM techniques. We also have joint inversion and a joint inversion based on petrophysically guided inversion. The benefit of SymPeg is that it's really modular, and so at each step of the inversion process, you can change the parameters to what you want, as opposed to kind of a black box where you just give it a data file and hit go and it runs, does something and spits it back. You really have control of how you're modeling your data. The other benefit of SymPeg is that it's not only set on a regular mesh, but it also includes an octree mesh, which is an adaptive mesh, so you can really discretize around where your stations are and really reduce the size of your model because you can expand it using much larger cells. So it should run faster to get it running on HPC. And it also comes with a cylindrical mesh. So if you want to model borehole EM or other types of borehole, you can do that as well. Right, so it comes with these different types of meshes, so tensor meshes, cylindrical meshes, and this tree mesh. So the octree mesh is going to be the one that will really benefit MT, because usually when you set out a survey, you set it out in a nice regular grid, but then you go and you see that land access isn't quite in a regular grid, and so your survey ends up like a shotgun scatter. And so discretizing around those different stations is much easier in the type of octree mesh or adaptive mesh. The other thing SymPeg could do is you can tell it which kind of norms you want to invert for. So the classic is L2, so it'll give you a nice smooth inversion. But you can also do an L1, which will give you a sharper inversion. And you can also combine the two, so you can do an L2 with an L1, so you get a smooth, compact, sharp model. And again, we've incorporated this with MTPy. So now in this 3 lines of code, you can run a 1D inversion of your transfer function data. Also building 2D and 3D as well. The other nice thing with SymPeg is that you can look at the fields that you're modeling. So here we're looking at, electric fields in a plane across some sort of anomaly. And at the bottom, you're looking at the magnetic fields across the body. So you can kind of understand where you might have sensitivity, where you might see different anomalies. This is nice to go back and remember your training as a grad student. So there is 3D capability in here. This is just an example on an octree mesh. of trying to model this L-shaped anomaly. And it does a reasonably good job. Of course, this is a toy example, so you could, change your modeling parameters to really get a better image of that L shape. But so this runs on your local machine, and takes about 10 minutes or so. That's it for SimPeg. And then I'd like to point you to the links for the different repositories. So if you want to have a look, there's documentation for each repository, and there's also the GitHub repository. You can install all these packages using PyPy if you're familiar with Python. You can also install them with Conda if you like as well. But yeah, here at the top, so there's a link to, at the top it says example notebooks. And these are notebooks that have the entire workflow that we just talked about. So if you're interested in having a look at that, that would be my first place to go. It shows you, examples on getting your metadata sorted, building MTH5s from the different data loggers, different ways of plotting using MTPy, setting up processing schemes using Aurora, and then modeling using SimPeg. And that's all we had. And it's hard to show, but again, thanks for your attention, and have a look. Feel free to contribute. If you find any issues with the codes, if you go on the GitHub websites, there's a tab that says issues, and that'll alert us that there's bugs, but not only alert us, but alert everyone else in the community. So maybe sometimes people have similar bugs, and that's a place you can go. It's kind of like a forum for codes. So yeah, thanks.
They got any questions? Click online. Do we have any questions from the room?
Yeah, the workshop meeting. Like, yeah, that's the third time I've heard that this week.
Seems like no questions from online.
Oh, there's a question.
I have a question.
Yes. Please go.
Does this course come with sample data?
Which code in the workflow? I guess, Jared, maybe you want to.
Yeah, so that package, we specifically set it up for the NCI. But there is another package under MT Geophysics called MT Example Data. And that's a repository where you can download example data.
Okay.
Yeah, and in some of the if you wanted sample, depending if you wanted sample time series, there's certainly some of the notebooks in the Aurora documentation show you how you would download data from, for example, the EarthScope server in the US. And for what it's worth, we tested those this week in the workshop, and people were able to access that data and process it.
Stuff you did on the Musgraves data?
Yeah, and the Musgraves, you would need to get, I guess, access to the NCI. But we did process the Musgraves as well this week. We did a notebook where we processed it. We processed the time series, and then we did another. We did a demo of QSub where we did the parallel process.
For those that are interested, the Musgraves time series data from the OSLAMP data set is now available in MTH5 for people that want a data set to trial, and it was very kind of Karl and Jared to look it through on the Musgraves, an Australian data set for us.
Yeah, Jared, you just mentioned the SimPy. it's getting powerful. Yeah, in the old days, I was in a workshop, I heard about it, mainly for educational purpose. So I never have thought of using it, but I heard it's very powerful now. So in terms of the outfit, case, for example, 500 sites, let's say just broadband data, is that capable of running a model with like hundreds of kilometers, 500 sites. How you?
Yes.
Case.
Yes. Yeah, as far as the real as far as a real example in SIPIC, we honestly, so the EM part is not quite optimized for large scale computing at the moment. They are working on it and hopefully we'll have something soon. But what they've done with potential fields is that if you have a large grid, you can cut the grid into little grids and then send those off to the run and then bring them back. And so I got a grad student who's done that, and he had something that was pretty big. It took about 24 hours to run, and this was a magnet version. And then he did the Thailand version, and it ran about 2 hours. However, but getting that to work with EM is a little bit more difficult because you have feedback between the different cells, and so you need to be clever about how you split your model up for different periods. So it's getting there, but maybe next year I'll have an update.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's open source.
This guy have a question.
Is it's the Lexi. Yeah, I guess he already asked. Hands up. Anyone else have questions? No, then we'll close today's talk. And thank you, Jared and Karl. Yeah.